Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be with all of you here today. As I was joking in the back, if you're ever going to have a heart attack, this is the room to have it. Someone will know how to help you out. But I appreciate you having me. It's an honor to be with you this morning. First, let me just thank you. Everyone who will come here today, I hope, will thank you for the work you do, not just for our communities, but for our country. When we talk about safety and security in America, and we talk about the real risks that we face, and we'll get to that in a moment, overseas and at home, if in fact, God forbid, there ever is a horrible incident in this country again, you'll be the first ones to respond. You were the first ones there in Boston. You were the first ones there in New York. And we pray that day will never come again, but if it does, you'll be the first to respond. You're a critical part of America's ability to deal with the threats we face in the 21st century, and we're grateful for the work you do every single day. I myself have, not just through the family connection of having two brother-in-laws, but numerous friends that I grew up with. In fact, I was joking with a few of my constituents from Florida just a moment ago that I grew up with a group of about 7 guys, and 5 of them became firefighters. I became the only politician, and the other one works for Whack and Hunt. But I'm sure he maybe knows first aid or something. But it's great to know that we have such quality people serving us. Back in September of 2012, I was on the campaign trail in Orlando with Mitt Romney. We were campaigning in Central Florida, and I had just finished giving a speech on the stage when someone who used to work for me that was working on his campaign came up to me with a very concerned look on her face and handed me a note that said, "You need to call home now." And I didn't know what that meant, and I said, "Well, what's happening?" She goes, "Just call your house now, or call home now." So I did, and I was informed that my daughter had been involved in a golf cart accident and that she was being airlifted, and that they had no further information. As it turns out, everything turned out okay, but as many of you know, I was incredibly worried for those 2 hours as I tried to get back to Miami to be at her side. And thank God that everything was fine. The only thing that gave me comfort during that moment was knowing that she was in the hands of well-trained and capable individuals who were going to treat her well because they treat everybody well, who were going to treat her the way they would treat their own daughter. And it gave me great comfort in knowing that the men and women that responded to that call were the best in the world at what they did. And I'll always be grateful for that. I want to talk to you today about America. I know you have issues that you're concerned about, and you should be, because the work you do puts you at risk for your own safety and health, not just now that you're working, but when you're done. We see the toll that the work you do takes on the human body. And you're well aware of it, and you knew those risks going in, but you were willing to do it anyways. And in my time in the state legislature, we did numerous things that recognize that once your service is done, the years of service take a toll physically and emotionally. The calls you run, the human tragedies you interact with, you're not robots. You're human beings with wives and husbands and daughters and sons and mothers and fathers. And oftentimes when you're called to respond to a horrible tragedy, you see that reflected in the people that you serve, and it impacts you emotionally as well. I'm aware of the toll that it takes, not just because of my family connection, but because of the hundreds of men and women who serve us as first responders across this country and across the state of Florida that I've interacted with. We're sensitive to the issues you care about. You're an important part of the ability of our governments to respond, and we'll continue to be allies and advocates for the causes that are important to your profession. But we're all Americans, and I want to talk to you a moment about the state of our country, because it's an issue that I know as patriots you care about deeply. In 2016, this country will have another election, and I propose to you that this election will not be a choice between 2 political parties. The question before us won't even be who gets to run the country. The fundamental question before us as Americans is, what kind of country are we going to be? For 230 some odd years, it's been a unique and exceptional one. I know a lot of people like to say that, but I think we can prove it. Imagine growing up in a society where no matter how hard you work or how talented you are, you can only go as far as your parents went. I want you to imagine for a moment living in a place where you are told it doesn't matter what you're good at or what you're willing to do to get ahead, because your parents weren't rich, because your parents weren't politically connected. There's things you just cannot do. Well, for you and I, those of us who have grown up in this country, it's hard to imagine that. But I was raised by people who grew up somewhere else, people who taught me that that's the way it is almost everywhere else on earth in the history of mankind, except for here. It is the one place in all of human history where your future was not determined by where you came from or what your parents did before you, but largely determined by how hard you were willing to work and how good you are at what you do. That's what's given us our identity. Every country in the world has rich people. Unfortunately, every country in the world has poor people. Every country has big businesses and politically connected individuals. What's made us different is that here we have millions and millions of people who work hard every day and have achieved happiness as they define it, or what we've come to call the American dream. And if there's something that bothers me, is that there are now millions of people in this country that don't think that's possible for people like them anymore. And the reason why they feel like that is because they keep reading in the newspaper that the economy is doing better, but they're still living paycheck to paycheck. They're not poor. They're making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. But depending on where you live, $60,000 or $70,000 a year sometimes means paycheck to paycheck. Many have done everything they were told they needed to do to succeed. They went to college, they got a degree, they show up to work on time. And yet everything costs more and their paycheck isn't keeping pace. So the natural reaction to that is, well, why is that happening? Whose fault is it? And there's no doubt that Washington and local and state governments have made mistakes that have contributed to it. But I want to tell you the fundamental reason behind why this is happening. It's not a temporary cyclical downturn in our economy. It is a permanent change in the structure of our economy. The world we live in today is dramatically different from the one I grew up in and the one you grew up in. Our economy is global. That means events halfway around the world have as much an impact on the bottom line here as something that's happening halfway across the country. It also means we have more competition than we've ever had for businesses and for jobs. Automation is real. There are machines that have replaced the work that people used to do. Now, there is promise to this new century and this new economy, the promise of creating new jobs to replace the ones that are gone. And in fact, those new jobs may pay more than the ones they're replaced. But those new jobs require skills and education that many of our people don't have. And so the result is we have these massive changes in the nature of our economy and public policies that do not reflect it. And the end result is you have millions of people who keep reading about how Wall Street's having record years and big companies have made more profits than ever before, but they themselves are locked out from the promise of the new economy. The question is, how do we fix it? There are three things we have to do. The first is we have to become globally competitive again. We have to become the best place in the world for people to invest and to innovate. That's what creates jobs. What creates jobs in the private sector is when people who have access to money or companies that have access to money take that money and reinvest it to grow their business or start a new one. And today, America is increasingly losing that competition to other countries because it is easier to do business there than it is here. They have less regulations. They have a simpler tax code. We can't allow that to continue to happen. We can compete with anyone in the world. Our workers are as good as any workers on this planet. But they need a fair shot, and they'll never get that fair shot if we have government policies that make it difficult to invest in America or innovate here again. So that's why I've proposed a pro-family, pro-growth tax reform that experts now say would grow the economy by 15% over what it's projected to grow over the next 10 years. That would increase the amount of money people take home. That would create an additional child tax credit for working families so that they can deal with the cost of raising children in the 21st century. That's why I think we need a regulatory budget in America to limit the impact that federal regulations have on the ability to grow a business or start a new one. And by the way, this has a direct impact on you as well. Because at the end of the day, most of you are paid based on collectively agreed to contracts with local and state governments. And those are largely based on how much money they're able to generate through their tax base. And if they don't have economic growth, their tax base cannot expand. And if their tax base cannot expand, and they have to make cuts, invariably they come to you and others like you for those cuts. Economic growth would benefit everybody. We need to trigger that economic growth. If I have a quarrel with my party, is that it usually stops there. Republicans, unfortunately, too often stop simply at economic growth and they don't talk anymore. Economic growth is important. It is the most important thing we can do. It cannot be the only thing that we do. Because economic growth will lead to millions of better paying jobs in America. But our people won't benefit from those jobs if they don't have the skills those jobs take. And the truth is, many of the best jobs in the 21st century, they require more than traditional high school, but less than 4 years of college. For the life of me, I don't understand why we've stigmatized vocational training in this country. Why we've told our children that if you don't wear a suit and tie to work, you're somehow not as good as someone who does. The truth is we still need plumbers and electricians and welders and machinists. And we can train people to do that work in high school so they graduate ready to go to work as a BMW technician in a construction trade instead of dropping out of high school because they don't care about Shakespeare. We should teach more kids and students in high school careers and skills that allow them to be employed the day they graduate from school. We also have to deal with the fact that you have millions of people in this country that have to work full-time and raise a family. And the only way they're ever going to get a raise is if they can go back to school and become a paralegal or a dental hygienist. But they can't. Take the case of a single mother who is a receptionist at a law firm, and she's raising 2 kids on her own, and she makes $10 an hour. The only way she's ever going to make more is if she can go back to school and become a paralegal. But she can't, because she has to wake up at 6:30 in the morning, make her kids breakfast, pack them their lunch, drop them off at school before 8. She has to rush to the office to be there before 9. She gets off at 5:30, has to hurry to daycare before it closes at 6:15. Then bring them home, make them dinner, make sure they do their homework, and put them to bed. It's 11 o'clock at night, and she's exhausted. She can't drop everything, her job, her kids, her family, and go off to a college for 4 years. We need flexible programs that allow people like that to learn online, on nights, on weekends, so that that single mom making $10 an hour as a receptionist can become a paralegal making $55,000 a year. And we can do that if we allow people to package learning, take life experience, work experience, military experience, and give them credit for what they already know. Listen, if you're one of the shortages we have is in long-haul truckers, people that haul across the country. Well, different states have different licensing agreements. And so you have people in America who used to drive trucks in the military who are not allowed now to drive trucks for a private company in the U.S. economy. And to me, it's pretty straightforward. If you are qualified to drive explosives on a dirt road in Afghanistan, then you are qualified to haul eggs on the interstate highway system of the United States. But we have licensing agreements that licensing requirements that don't allow people to do that in some places. By the way, college has to change too. We have an extraordinary amount of student loan in America, and it is often held by people who have a degree that doesn't lead to a job. And I think before you take out $40,000 or $50,000 in student loans, you deserve to be told how much you can expect to make when you graduate with that degree. So you can decide whether it's worth borrowing $40,000 to be a Greek philosophy major. Because the market for Greek philosophers is tight. But before you borrow, listen, I graduated with over $100,000 in student loans. And I paid it off, by the way, a couple years ago with the proceeds of my book, An American Son, which you can buy on paperback if you're interested. We're now paying my kids' loans, My point is, this student loan thing is a big problem. Because it's not just the amount of money you own, it ruins your credit. It locks you out of the housing market. You can't even qualify for a mortgage if you're making $15 an hour and are sitting on $50,000 in student loans. We have to deal with that as well. Part of it is creating more competition for traditional colleges. Part of it is creating options for people to learn without having to borrow all that money. But if we give our people the tools they need to succeed in the 21st century, the skills they need for these better paying jobs, and we create the economic growth that we need, then we're going to have another American century. I know you keep hearing about all this bad news out there, but the truth is there's no nation on earth I would trade places with. I wouldn't trade places with China. First of all, in China, they have no political freedom. They have no religious freedom. Their air and water is polluted. And their economy is controlled largely by a bunch of corrupt government officials. I wouldn't trade places with India. I wouldn't trade places with Russia. There's no nation on earth I would rather be than us. And there's no reason why the 21st century can't also be an American century. But to deal with it, we have to deal with it. And before we feel sorry for ourselves, we have to understand that every generation of American before us was asked to make the exact same choice. Every generation before us has been asked the same fundamental question. Are you prepared to do what it takes to keep America special? And for over 2 centuries, the answer has been yes. Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, their generation faced the challenges of their time. And because they did, they left for us a country better than their own. And now, the question for us is whether we're willing to do the same. Every single one of us has a unique story to bring to this perspective, but I have one, to me, the American dream I hold dear. My parents came to this country in 1956. My father lost his mother when he was 9 years of age. He went to work, left school, never went back to school, and would work for the next 70 years. My mother was one of 7 girls raised by a disabled father in a developing country in Cuba. They struggled. They couldn't get ahead no matter how hard they worked. So on May 27, 1956, they boarded an airplane and came to New York City, to the only country in the world where they thought people like them could have a chance. Their first years in America were not instant success. In fact, by 1958, 59, they were so discouraged that they actually thought about going back to Cuba. Boy, am I glad they didn't. But they stayed and they persevered. And in less than a decade after having arrived here with no money, little command of the English language, no connections and no power, my parents began to achieve the American dream. They were never rich. They never owned more than that home or that one car. But my parents achieved the American dream. Because the American dream is not about how much money you make. The American dream is not about being rich. The American dream is not about how many things you own on the day you die. The American dream is about achieving happiness. And my parents achieved happiness because just a decade removed from despair and poverty, they owned a home in a safe and stable neighborhood. And they were able to leave for their children a life better than their own. And they were able to retire with dignity and security. That's the real American dream. And to me, it's deeply personal, as it is to many of you. I often speak at venues like this in the evenings, most of the time. And in a ballroom like this, there's usually like a bartender standing behind a bar at the back of the room. I know that most of you are not familiar with bartenders, but... and it reminds me of my father. My mother worked in this country primarily as a maid at a hotel, a cashier at Kmart, a stock clerk at Kmart. But my father worked primarily as a bartender at hotels, Miami Beach, Las Vegas, and then ultimately Coconut Grove before he retired at, I think, 78 years of age. He stood behind that bar for decades. The weddings and the bar mitzvah and all the other events that come along, the holidays and the weekends. And look, I know there were nights he didn't want to go to work. I know there were days he wished he could just call in sick or stay home. But my father stood behind that bar for all those years so that one day I would have the chance to stand behind a podium like this one. And the journey from behind that bar to where I stand today, that's the essence of the American dream. And you know it because you're living it now. Virtually everyone in this room had someone who loved you, who made your future the purpose of their life. And virtually everyone in this room has someone they love, who they hope will have a life even better than their own. On the days you don't feel like going to work, on the days when you're tired, on the days when perhaps you think that what you do is not rewarded, understand that it is. Not just because of the service you provide, but because of the doors that you're opening for your children, your grandchildren, and those you will leave behind. And what we're called to do now is to preserve that dream for another generation of Americans, to ensure that we still remain a special and unique country unlike any other in human history. And I believe we will succeed. Because at the end of the day, what unites us as one common people is not a common heritage or a common ethnicity or a common religion. What unites us as one people, despite our many political differences, is that all Americans believe that everyone deserves the chance to go as far as their talent and their work will take them. And what we're called to do now is to confront the challenges to that in this new century, to see the things that are standing in the way of that for millions of Americans and to remove those obstacles, not just so the American dream can survive, but so that it can reach more people than ever before. And if we do this, if we can achieve this, then I tell you with full confidence, our children will be the freest and most prosperous Americans that have ever lived. The American dream won't just survive, it'll reach more people than it's ever reached before. And you and I will be able to leave for our children what Americans always leave their children, what my parents left for me and what your parents left for you, the single greatest nation in the history of all mankind. Again, I'm grateful for everything you do. God bless all of you. Stay safe. God bless you.